Got it.
All right. Hi, Venance. Thank you so much for doing this today.
Hi, Deepika. Yes. Glad to be doing this.
Just to introduce our speaker for today, Venance is the host of a podcast called Men Talk Mental Health. And Venance, I'm going to invite you to talk a little bit more about your podcast.
Yes. So, Men Talk Mental Health is a podcast between me and one of my closest friends. His name is Ayush. He is based out of LA in the US, and I'm based out of Bombay. So we actually record this during my day and his night, and we record it obviously he's in his bedroom and I'm in my room, and then we take our audio files and we piece it together. We put a lot of effort to try and gain like good quality. But in terms of the podcast, essentially, it is called Men Talk Mental Health because we're two men talking about our personal journeys with regards to mental health. But it's for everybody. In fact, 50% of our listeners are actually women, and the topics we cover are fairly broad. The reason why we decided to do this is because when we started our journey of looking after our respective mental health, we did not find resources which reflected, let's say, 30-year-old men, or in general, we didn't find resources for men and the specific issues that we were dealing with. So we decided, why not we create a resource, because we had a year of learning. Both of us went into therapy simultaneously, but separately. He was in the US, I was here. And we would exchange notes, we would exchange our learnings. And I had this idea that, I think I should write a blog. It will be, even if it helps one person, the objective is accomplished. And Ayush said, why not we record a podcast? And I was like, okay, wow, this is cool. Let's do it. And yeah, and that's how the podcast came into being last year.
No, I absolutely agree. I think there are really resources that are lacking, specifically related to men's mental health. And as for the quality of the podcast, until you told me that you guys are in separate locations, I thought that you all were in the same room, sitting in recording, having an actual conversation. Okay, so any observation that has stood out to you from these conversations, specifically around men's mental health?
The conversations between Ayush and I?
Yeah.
Yes. The recurring themes that have come up during our conversation. So one, it started with anxiety and panic. So I was experiencing debilitating anxiety before the pandemic, just before the pandemic, and I started seeking help through therapy just before the pandemic. So initially the conversations were a lot about that, and Ayush was dealing with panic, and he would, like, if you've heard some of the episodes, so he would have panic attacks while driving on the freeway and stuff like that. So really scary stuff. So it started off talking about anxiety and panic, but it went on, as we sort of went on our parallel mental health journeys, we kind of realized where all of this was stemming from. And for me, it was coming from my childhood. So our conversations then moved to understanding the dynamic between our parents and us, and the way we grew up and how it impacted us for good and for bad. We spoke a lot about the father-son relationship, because personally, I've had a very strange relationship with my father, and it's impacted me in many ways. Essentially, there was emotional abandonment, and I didn't really realize how it impacted me until I started therapy, because I thought, I'm like, yeah, this is just how it is, and this is how he is, and this is how the relationship is. So our conversations, we spoke a lot about that, and then eventually, of course, we also realized that we were not finding resources which spoke about these topics specifically in this context of men, father, son, just in general, men being vulnerable and having a space for it. We did not hear other men talk about it, whether it was on podcasts, in our actual lives. And we had each other through that time. And the idea of the podcast is to sort of create content that is honest, genuine, and at the same time relatable to people.
Oh no, absolutely. I think for me personally, as I heard the episodes and I saw the transition from talking about the reasons why you all went into therapy to what you all discovered, I think for me, it gave me a perspective on how the client witnesses the process of therapy. Because even as as therapists, when we go for therapy, we kind of know that there's going to be a set structure. We know what's going to happen. But I think for me, it gave me a perspective of how the client views therapy. So I think you all are achieving a lot more than what you all did set out to do. But I think what I would like to understand from you, Venance, is your journey with mental health to whatever extent you're comfortable sharing, of course.
Absolutely. No, I'm definitely an open book. I'd like to be an open book and share it because I think it will help people. So my journey started if I had to look back at the source, or rather when I started noticing something, was somewhere around 2015, where I would wake up feeling anxious. And I would ask myself, what's up? I've just woken up. I'm in my bed. Everything is fine. I'm safe. Why am I feeling anxious? It's the first feeling. Like, I would open my eyes and I would feel anxious. And I remember talking to my then girlfriend about it, and she said, "I think you need to talk to somebody about it. You need to speak to a therapist." And I was very open to the idea back then, but I never took that first step. I did not think about why I was not making that first step. Maybe I thought that this wasn't that big an issue. It was only in the mornings and I wouldn't feel it through the day, and it did not really impact my life. But in 2019, at the end of 2019, the amount of anxiety I would experience increased twofold, threefold, maybe even more, like definitely more than normal levels of anxiety that one would experience on a day-to-day basis. And it stemmed from poor gut health. That was where it stemmed from. I was very aware of the immediate root source or root cause of the anxiety. And I had a couple of panic episodes where I landed up going to the emergency room in a bunch of hospitals, and they would check me in terms of my vital symptoms, and everything would be fine. And they would be like, "Sir, everything's okay." And I was like, "How is everything okay? I don't feel great." I would feel extremely weak, dizzy, cold sweats, feel like something's wrong, breathless. But as soon as I would get to the ER, they would check my vitals. Everything was fine. Literally, I wouldn't even get any medication. And it was the second time that I went to the ER where the responder, the emergency responder, looked at me and he said, "Do you stress a lot?" And I said, "Yes, I do. I do stress quite a bit, and I do worry quite a bit." And he just said that, and he kind of like he wasn't a very friendly person, but he just said that, and he left that thought in my head. And I went back to my GP, and I did a whole bunch of blood tests. I was determined to find something wrong in my body, because that was the answer I was looking for. But everything came normal, and the GP, she looked at me and she said, "It's in your mind." And that was, I think that was a bit of a turning point for me. And I remember being in the car with a friend of mine who drove me to the doctor, and I was staying at his place because I was too I was too scared to live by myself in my apartment. And I remember uh, being in extreme distress and almost in tears, saying, I don't know what this is, um, but I'm going to figure it out. And I started therapy. I found a great therapist through another therapist friend. I actually reached out to her and she said, I can't be a therapist because we know each other. And she gave me a bunch of contacts and I picked one. I read through everyone's profiles. I read through what their interests were, what they did, etc. I did not know the difference between the different schools of therapy, but I picked one that I thought I could relate to, and I've done 40 sessions with her over 2 years, and I've done a lot of great work with her, and that was the start of my journey. This was just before the pandemic. I've met her once in person, but that hasn't stopped the impact, the positive impact that it has had. And therapy was something that definitely helped, but eventually I did seek psychiatric help, um, even though I had this huge mental block towards psychiatric medication. But I think it came to a point wherein it was normalized. For me, I spoke to a few people, and I was like, "Oh, quite a few people are actually on anti-anxiety medication or antidepressants." And I was like, "Okay, great. This is not as unusual as I thought it was." And that was another that definitely also helped. Yeah. So that's the journey in a nutshell, and it's definitely starts with being aware and then seeking help and then doing the work. I would go to each therapy session prepared. I would have my agenda points, and after each session there were certain points that the therapist would point out that I should think about, and I would take that seriously, and I would do the work, and I would go into each session, with a certain amount of homework done, with a certain amount of topics that I wanted to talk about. And I really made the most of it. And yeah, so that's been the journey with professional help. But on my own, I've paid a lot of attention to my sleep cycle. I definitely have paid attention to my feelings and how I feel through different parts of the day. Just sort of being very self-aware and been practicing mindfulness as much as I can. I've used the apps like Headspace, and now I'm using this app called Unwinding Anxiety by Dr. Judd Brewer. I hope I've got his name right, but he's a neuroscientist and a psychiatrist who wrote this fantastic book and released it just before the pandemic, and now has an app. And he basically uses mindfulness as a way of dealing with anxiety. And he himself had debilitating anxiety and gut health issues, so I could relate a lot with him. And so I read the book, and now I'm actually using the app, and it's super helpful. So I continue to do the work even though I'm probably in the best mental health I've ever been in the last 2.5, 3 years.
That's awesome, and I think you're every therapist's dream client. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm actually really glad that you had resources to also seek help. I think I'd like to understand from you that does gender play a role in seeking mental health help, in your opinion?
So I think I've been fortunate. I think I definitely come from a privileged class. I think my parents have worked hard enough to give me that kind of privilege, and it a couple of things. So one is obviously privilege. The second thing is I as a person have been very open to talking about my feelings, and I'm very comfortable talking about my feelings to women. So some of my closest friends are women, and in fact, if I had to share my feelings or what's on my mind and be really honest and transparent, the men that I would talk to would probably be, there'll be a handful, but in terms of women, there are quite a few. And I've felt definitely a sense of empathy. I think just in terms of personally, I'm sure I'm generalizing here, but I felt like I was very comfortable talking to women about my feelings. And I had those kind of women in my life as well. So lots of great friends who were just great listeners. I'm very lucky to have male friends and family like that as well. But I would say I think they're fewer. So whether gender plays a role in accessing mental health, what I've observed is that there are definitely men who are not fully comfortable being vulnerable. And there could be many reasons for that. I'm not sure. It could be societal conditioning, it could be the way they grew up, etc. Um, but I've noticed that they would maybe take their emotions and their difficulties and put it under the carpet, resist it, and have this idea or this notion in their head that they've got to be strong for the people around them. And I question that idea of strength, because I don't know if that is what is being strong. Because I've seen older men in my life who have imploded in their 50s and 60s because they've not had channels to emote. And that is definitely one thing. I think just being able to be vulnerable. One thing I've noticed is the emotional vocabulary. I find that in my experience, a lot of the men in my life lack that vocabulary. They're trying. Sometimes they're definitely trying. I think, at least when it comes to me, they feel like, okay, I can talk to him about certain things. I think he can understand, and they're trying to express it, but they're really struggling to express it. And I'm definitely reading in between the lines. I'm observing body language, and I'm trying not to make any guesses on their behalf and just sort of listen for the sake of listening. But I can see that they're struggling with the words to describe what they're really feeling. So yeah, I don't know if I've digressed, but going back to whether gender plays a role in seeking mental health. So I personally am very comfortable reaching out to women, and I've noticed that if I have 10 numbers of different therapists, 8 would be women,
Yeah.
and about 2 or maybe 1 would be a man. And so that's the other piece of this question. There are definitely a lot more women in the profession in terms of mental health support and professionals, whether it's therapy or psychiatry. And I would assume that a man would be more comfortable talking to another man. And this assumption is based on, so my father himself consults with a psychiatrist for his own mental health. And I was part of the process of trying to find him help, because he would not be able to do it himself. And my brother and I took the lead, and we found therapists and psychiatrists, and we tried different approaches. And our assumption that he was more comfortable with a man who was maybe his age or slightly old, or at least an older man, let's say past his 40s, and maybe would find it easy to relate. And it turns out the psychiatrist that he has consulted for the last 6-7 years consistently is a man, and is about 40 years old, definitely an authoritative figure in his style. And I think that worked with my father. In general, he's a man who lacks the emotional vocabulary, and so it's definitely not easy for the psychiatrist, but he has kind of figured out a way to relate to him. And yeah, so I think that definitely plays a role. I think one is, I would think that most men maybe find it a little difficult to be vulnerable. And then if they're looking for help, maybe they don't find enough uh, representatives in the medical community or even amongst their circles who they can sort of talk to about their mental health. I got really lucky. I had Ayush through my journey, and I still have Ayush. We still talk about everything under the sun, and we talk about we're really honest with each other, and there's nothing to hide. We can be very transparent about our deepest weaknesses, our deepest thoughts and concerns. And yeah, I don't think men have that. I don't think many men have that.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And I think a lot of what you brought up is something that even we've observed while working in the industry. When even when men come to us as clients, sometimes they do lack the emotional vocabulary or the support in their life that they would need. So I definitely do see what you are saying. You said something around the lines of that, you personally are more comfortable talking to women, and about 50% of your listeners are also women. Any insight that you've noticed in men talking about their mental health or men seeking support through your podcast? Anything that's come up for you?
Oh yes, absolutely. The objective was, if one person benefits from this podcast, then the job is done. But I think now the vision has to definitely be brighter, because we've positively impacted more than a person, and people have reached out. I've had male friends who've reached out to me saying that they are now open to seeking help, and several of them have taken numbers from me. Several of them have asked me for advice. Several of them have said that, okay, we are ready to uh, do this. So I think that was definitely heartwarming. And through the podcast, we try not to preach, but only share our personal experiences and what we've learned from it. Um, and I think quite a few people have found it relatable. We've actually had even women listeners reach out and say, we find this very relatable, and it's great to hear people of the similar age, from a similar background, maybe even the Indian context. Even though Ayush lives in the US, he grew up in India, and he's part of the Indian diaspora now that is in the West. So we had quite a few people who said that uh, we've opened up their eyes to what the experience is like, and we've normalized the conversation around mental health. So quite a few people have reached out, and I think that was definitely like heartwarming to hear. And like I said, the idea was just to like talk about our lives, and hopefully people can relate to it. But for people to relate to it and then decide to take further action is amazing.
Okay. I think you've done an excellent job with your podcast, and thank you so much for doing what you do. Thank you so much for conversing with us here, and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me onto this call. And the podcast is dormant at this particular point of time. It's been dormant for a while. We have recorded an episode, and we want to record more. I think post-pandemic life has caught up with us, with everything opening up, and just trying to match each other's schedules. But hopefully soon, we've had some. We still have people who reach out to us saying you should continue, and I think, yeah, that's the kind of encouragement that definitely helps. And yeah, thanks for having me over, and I really hope this is good for your viewers and it's helpful.
Absolutely. And we're hoping for more episodes soon.
Yep, I'll definitely let you know.
All right.
All
Thanks.
right. Thanks, Deepika. Take care.